Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in the auditorium of Maastricht University. It's a great pleasure to see so many people in this auditorium and to also see such a large cortege with colleagues from actually every faculty that we have. That's really a compliment to you already, that you see so many colleagues from the 6 faculties that we have and also some colleagues from abroad. Welcome also for joining us on this very special occasion. My name is Rianne Letschert and I'm the Rector Magnificus of this beautiful university, and I have the honor of chairing this academic session. And in a few moments I will hand over the floor for the inaugural lecture of Professor Franziska Gassmann, a moment that not only she but also her colleagues have been eagerly awaiting. This becomes clear when you speak to the people at UNU Merit and the School of Governance who are so pleased for her. Now, I have a spy, actually in every faculty, but also in your school and in UNU Merit. So I got some information. By all accounts, what I heard when talking to different people through the spy, I cannot do that all myself, they say this appointment is so very well deserved. If you keep your ear to the ground, you'll find that Franziska has no shortage of positive qualities. Now, in this speech, I will have to limit myself to just 4 of them, because I don't have too much time, because you still have to give your lecture. Now, the first is her social engagement. Her field of expertise, poverty and social protection, has been her passion ever since she first arrived in Maastricht as a student. These days, her work fits seamlessly with the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which aim to completely eradicate poverty. But long before these goals were formulated, Franziska was already working on them. When it comes to the term impact factor, academics generally think of the scholarly value of their publication. But for you, impact is about making real change. Now, this is one of her most defining qualities. For Franziska, the reports she writes for instance, UNICEF and the World Bank have to really mean something for the countries they concern. And she also puts her expertise to good use building capacity in faraway countries. Now, the second character I would like to characterize you is your enormous capacity to adapt. Now, before she moved to the Netherlands in the early 1990s for her great love, Willem, in her home country of Switzerland, she was a crafts teacher and assistant purchaser for a large department store, visiting fashion fairs in Paris and Milan. I think I have the right information, huh? You're still... She would even be promoted to head purchaser. Instead, she began her studies in Maastricht with the program International Economic Studies and was the best in her class, always well prepared and extremely motivated. That's what your teachers, your former teachers say. And besides that mental agility, she's also literally highly agile. So much is clear when she hits the dance floor. Jazz dance has been her outlet for years, and she has even recently taken up ballet. Hats off to you, Professor, and I will not do it because it's always difficult to put them back on the right place, eh? Especially with this one that's moving already. Which brings me to her third important threat, which is her drive. If Franziska Gassmann wants something, it will happen, her colleagues say. If she's going to do something, she's going to do it well. And she expects the same from her students, PhD candidates, and everyone she works with. First-year PhD candidates may be a bit intimidated by her direct feedback style. I'm just looking around if they recognize it. They don't dare to nod now. But they quickly learn that it helps them grow, after which they have the greatest admiration for her. One of the people I spoke to said, and I quote, "She has the knowledge and the skills to bring others further. She's reliable and has great integrity in everything she does." End quote. Last but not least, the fourth, I'm almost there. The fourth quality I want to touch upon is her deep bond with her homeland and family. Her parents in Switzerland, her stepdaughter Sanna with husband Matthias and grandchild Elias in Austria. They are all of the utmost importance for her. Not to mention the mountains. When at the very last resort you try to ski off a little mount in your garden in Maastricht, then you know just how much you miss the Swiss Alps. And at the same time, Franziska, you are a model immigrant with a good command of the Dutch language. You may be wondering now, there must be something about her that is less than perfect. Well, one of her lesser qualities, I've been told, is her poker face. Because with Franziska, you can always tell from her face exactly how she feels. But if you ask me, that's actually quite a positive quality. Now, I would like to bring this brief story about your personality to a close with my most heartfelt congratulations on this wonderful milestone in your career. A professorship does not in itself have a direct impact on poverty or social protection, but I sincerely hope, and I think it will happen like that, it will open even more doors for you and thus only strengthen the impact of your important work. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Franziska Gassmann with her inaugural lecture, Inclusive Virtuous Circles, Why Governments Need to Invest in Social Protection and Why It's in Their Own Best Interest. Thank you very much.
I'm truly humbled. Thank you so much for these very, very kind words. Mevrouw de rector, meneer de decaan, eerdere decanen die we hier hebben, hooggeleerde collega's, lieve familie, vriend, we al heute hier aangekomen zijn, dear colleagues, students, friends, ladies and gentlemen. The world has come a long way since the early 1990s and the establishment of the Millennium Development Goals. Poverty reduction is considered a success story. More than 1 billion people have escaped extreme poverty, and other human development indicators have also improved remarkably. It seems we are living in a much better world today than 2 decades ago. Yet, a staggering 700 million people are still extremely poor, which is about 10% of the world population. More than half of them are living in a country in sub-Saharan Africa. Moreover, those that have been left behind have not seen an improvement in their living conditions over the past 2 decades. The average distance of the poor to the poverty line as such remained unchanged. What does it mean to be poor? It is not simply a matter of having little money. It means not being able to participate in society, to forego treatment in case of sickness, not being able to give the children a better future, not having clean water or safe housing. It means to be stuck in a vicious circle because in order to improve one's livelihood, money is needed to buy assets or even to find a job. In every aspect, the poor have way fewer options to deal with risks and shocks. Some of the consequences of a life in poverty are constant food insecurity, lower educational achievements, a lower health status. Sorry. Willem, maybe you should tell my parents that they will have to be silent. I'm really sorry, they cannot be here, but they are watching us on Skype. It's the only way for them to be present. But they will have also to be silent. Please. Ihr müsst ruhig sein, wir hören euch alle. Okay, sorry. Okay, where was I? Okay. So, the consequences of a life in poverty are food insecurity, lower educational achievements, lower health status, lower life expectancy, and a high vulnerability towards economic and natural shocks. These are all factors that affect our productivity, which is a key determinant of a country's economic potential. Children are particularly at risk of living in poverty. Every fifth child in the developing world is extremely poor. Globally, children account for more than half of the extreme poor. Hence, it is no surprise that in 2016, 155 million children under the age of 5 showed signs of chronic malnutrition. This is 23% of all children of this age group, globally. Child poverty and malnutrition have devastating consequences in the long term, not only for the children themselves, but for the societies they live in. We know from research that deprivation in childhood causes irreparable damages in the physical, emotional, and cognitive development of individuals. Childhood is a unique window of opportunity to make long-lasting investments. Children have specific basic needs, and failure to meet them jeopardizes their development and deprives them in their capacities. Poor children are also very likely to become poor adults. As an example, estimations on data from Eurostat suggest that in countries like Croatia, Hungary, or Bulgaria, which are not too far from us, more than 90% of poor adults were also deprived during childhood. In September 2015, the global community pledged to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger by 2030. How likely is it that we will achieve this objective? Economic growth alone will not do the trick, as various forecasts have shown. Only if the poor benefit more from economic growth than the rich, we might achieve the goal. Hence, the redistribution of income and wealth has to be part of the game. Or, in the words of Jim Yong Kim, the president of the World Bank, we need to find an economic growth model that's inclusive, that lifts up the poorest citizens rather than maintains those at the top. If the first Sustainable Development Goal, and poverty in all its forms everywhere, is to be taken seriously, most low and middle income countries have a considerable challenge ahead. It will require substantial efforts at global and national level. It requires policies that address chronic poverty traps and improve the lives of poor and vulnerable populations. Social protection policies can play a decisive role in this endeavor, and that is what I would like to talk about in the remainder of this lecture. Some of you may wonder, what am I exactly referring to? What is social protection? But most of you have or will benefit from social protection policies over the course of your lives. Depending on the country where you were born, your mother has been granted paid pregnancy leave. Your parents may have received a birth grant and enjoyed regular family benefits until you reached adulthood. During your working life, some of you got ill, maybe had a work accident, or even lost a job. If that happened in Europe, you were covered by our national social insurance systems. These shocks did not endanger your ability to make ends meet because you were protected by the system. It gave you time to get better or to find another job. Even in the worst case, when all income sources are exhausted, the state offers us protection. We can apply for income support. These safety nets guarantee a minimum income such that our basic needs are covered. For us, living and working in Europe, this is normal. We take it for granted. Yet, globally, only 45% of the population enjoys some kind of social protection. 4 billion are completely unprotected. There is no single definition of social protection, yet all definitions encompass the provision of public programs for the prevention, the reduction, and elimination of economic and social vulnerabilities. Typical components are social insurance policies, social assistance or safety nets, and social services. Now, entitlements to social insurance depend on previous employment records, but the eligibility for social assistance does not depend on any contributions made in the past. That is also why we refer to them as non-contributory social protection. These programs are financed from government resources, and they are intended to support consumption and access to social services. Cash transfers are an essential component of any well-developed social protection system. Near cash, in-kind, nutrition and health interventions can also provide valuable support to poor households. Social services and programs to ensure access to services such as education or health further promote the capacity of households. In my work, I am particularly interested in the potential of social assistance policies, given that in developing countries, the share of people covered by formal social insurance program is very limited. In this inaugural lecture, I would like to address 3 related questions. What is the role of social protection for poverty reduction? Why should governments invest in social protection? And last but not least, is there an ideal policy model? In Europe, social protection policies have a long history. They played a major role in the reduction of inequality until the mid-1980s of the last century, and they remain very important for the poverty reduction. In 2016, social transfers reduced poverty in the European Union by 1/3. In Finland, Denmark, Norway, countries very well known for their comprehensive welfare states, social transfers reduced poverty rates by half. You may now think that these countries are very rich and that poverty is hardly an issue. Yet, the share of the population at risk of poverty before transfers is about the same in Finland or Denmark as it is in Bulgaria or Greece. What matters is the fact that the social protection systems in countries like Finland or Denmark support almost all people living in jobless or poor households. The direct reduction of poverty is not the only positive outcome. Because our social protection systems are largely financed through taxes and contributions, they also redistribute income and wealth. Although both transfers and taxes contribute to the reduction of inequality, in high-income countries, social protection transfers alone account for 3/4 of the reduction. Europe also shows us what social protection means for child poverty. Just to give you 2 examples. In Ireland, social transfers reduced the incidence of child poverty by 2/3. In Bulgaria, transfers were responsible for a 25% lower incidence of child poverty. The correlation between child poverty reduction and social spending on families and children is very strong. Higher expenditures are associated with larger reductions in child poverty. Even though social protection policies play an important role in the European Union, our welfare states are under constant pressure and subject to reforms. During the last economic crisis, not too long ago, many countries took austerity measures, thereby reducing the budget available for social protection, and that exactly at a time when it was most needed. Last resort social protection schemes, such as the minimum income guarantee programs, have also undergone major reforms in many countries in the meantime. In the Netherlands, for example, social assistance receipt became increasingly conditional. The state mandates a certain behavior of beneficiaries, which attests to the presumption that welfare recipients are by definition passive. They need to be activated. Yet, most beneficiaries are only looking for one thing: to find work so that they no longer depend on the state. In low and middle income countries, social protection is even more important, but also more contested. The share of the population that is poor or living in vulnerable conditions is high. The exposure to shocks, be it economic, social, political, or climate-related, is considerably higher. Yet, governments are reluctant to invest in social protection policies. The right to social protection has been progressively recognized and realized around the world over the last century. Social protection and a decent standard of living are human rights. They are entrenched in international agreements such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The potential of social protection systems for the eradication of poverty also features prominently in the Sustainable Development Goals. Target 1.3 requires countries to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and by 2030, achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. Social protection is also expected to play a role in achieving other Sustainable Development Goals, such as number 5, achieving gender equality and empowerment for women and girls, and number 10, which is about the reduction of inequality within and among countries. Over the last decade or two, an overwhelming body of evidence has been established that confirms the positive effects of social protection in low and middle income countries. Social assistance, and in particular cash transfers, play an important role in guaranteeing a minimum consumption level for poor and vulnerable households. They enable productive livelihoods. They promote the access and utilization of other public services like education or health. Cash transfers have also been proven to be effective tools to reduce poverty and inequality. They increase human and physical capital, generate local multiplier effects, and they foster economic and social mobility. It is widely acknowledged that social protection policies strengthen the resilience of households against economic, social, and climate shocks. They support economic growth and productivity and act as social stabilizers. Despite this overwhelming positive evidence of social protection, many governments in low and middle income countries remain reluctant towards the idea. Yes, almost all countries in the world offer at least one type of social support. And yes, the number of countries with cash transfer programs for the poor has increased considerably over the last 10 years. Yet these programs are often small, they are not anchored in national legislation or operate only on a pilot basis. So the policymakers' hesitation to fully embrace social protection is basically guided by three preconceptions. First, there are the populist arguments that the poor do not deserve public support because it is their own fault that they are in this position. They are lazy, and if we give them money, they have no incentive to participate in the labor market and earn their own income. Emily Badger and Margot Sander-Katz succinctly explained in a recent article in the New York Times how, after 400 years, we still distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving poor, the idle versus the industrious, the able-bodied versus the old and the sick. It is also an argument that I have heard repeatedly from government officials. In our own research, therefore, we have been able to show for some countries that cash transfers have no negative effect on the labor market participation, and other authors came to the similar conclusions for other countries. The second preconception stems from fiscal considerations. Governments in low-income countries claim that they cannot afford social protection, that the group in need of support is simply too large. The International Labour Organization has convincingly shown that fiscal space can always be found if there is political will. Finally, the third preconception is that public spending for social protection is a cost and not an investment. And this brings me to the core argument of this speech. Why should governments invest in social protection? They have good reason to do so, and we can make several arguments. The first argument relates to the changing demographic context, which also played a role in the emergence of European welfare states. The Industrial Revolution changed work and living arrangements, and demographic changes led to the rise of nuclear families. The elderly and disabled were no longer cared for within families, and workers needed protection in case of sickness or age when they would no longer be able to work. According to the theory of the welfare pentagon, developed by my former colleague, Professor Christen Neubohr, households have in principle 5 channels to manage risks and cope with the effects of a shock. Within the household itself, through markets, social networks, membership organizations, or through the state. Yet, not all these channels may be available or effective. Traditional informal safety nets are on the decline. In the context of urbanization and globalization where we live in nowadays, family members migrate to cities or even abroad, often leaving the elderly and the children behind. In the best case, they manage to improve their situation and support the family financially. However, adult children might actually be too poor to help their parents. This was, for example, a common phenomenon during the economic transition in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Elderly parents had to support their adult children, which was, by the way, possible thanks to the remaining pension systems, which guaranteed a low but regular income. Another example comes from contemporary Mongolia, where rural households sent informal transfers, predominantly in kind, to family members that migrated to the capital city, and not the other way around, as one would expect. Now, two key arguments stem from public economics. First, markets may fail to provide adequate insurance against the impacts of various risks. In low-income countries, the risks and the related costs are often aggravated, and private insurance markets are missing or very thin. Second, an individual's failure to manage risks can impose costs on others in the society. Think, for example, of communicable diseases that are untreated due to the lack of health insurance or financial means to go and see a doctor. And if large groups remain uninsured, the social costs may be very high. In my view, the most powerful argument for investments in social protection relates to economic growth. Economic growth, although essential for a country's development, does not necessarily lead to a substantial poverty reduction. About, I think, 10 years ago, a new paradigm entered the development debate: inclusive growth. Inclusive growth creates opportunities for all in a society and ensures that everybody benefits from increased prosperity. And that eventually will strengthen economic growth. My dear colleague, Professor Adam Schirmay, better known to us as Eddie, and could unfortunately not be here today, has devoted most of his life to the study of economic development. His focus is on the macroeconomic side predominantly, yes, yet his theories are extremely useful to make my case and make the link to the microeconomy, or in other words, the people living in this economy. According to Adam Schirmay, economic growth derives from proximate, intermediate, and ultimate factors. Examples for proximate factors are technological change, capital accumulation, and labor productivity. Aggregate demand, national policies, or a change in the terms of trade are intermediate factors. Examples for ultimate sources of growth are geographic conditions, demographic trends, or social attitudes and power relations prevailing in a country. Social protection is linked to economic growth through different transmission channels at the household level, community level, and national level. Social protection enables households to invest in human capital and livelihoods. It acts as a stabilizer of internal demand, particularly at the community level, and it fosters social cohesion and inclusion at the national level. Armando Barrientos refers in this context to growth-mediating processes. Social transfers have the potential to remove credit and liquidity constraints, protect assets and consumption, and enable poor households to better allocate their resources. Hence, the role of social protection for inclusive growth and development is manifold. It redistributes income to the poor and vulnerable. It enables households to make better investments, and it helps households to manage risks. Social protection contributes to economic growth in its traditional definition by increasing a country's output. But it also makes growth inclusive by enabling the poor and vulnerable to participate and benefit from economic growth. During the last 5 years, I have dedicated a lot of my time to empirically prove this argument. If we can show that investments in social protection generate positive returns, or in the words of the title, induce a virtuous circle, we will have a powerful argument in favor of allocating resources to social protection, even in poor countries. Together with my colleagues, we have established a conceptual framework and developed a methodology to calculate ex ante the expected rates of return of investing in social protection. So far, we have applied our method to countries as diverse as Cambodia, Lesotho, and Uganda. This year, we have started a similar project in Kenya. Our analysis shows that in the long term, the benefits of providing cash transfers to poor and vulnerable households exceeds the costs. This is good news and bad news. The good news is that the returns are eventually positive. The bad news, it takes a long time. Why bad? Just think. The decision whether or not to invest in social protection relies with politicians that are often myopic, standing in for policies that will only, let's say, pay back after several government cycles takes foresight and political courage. And this brings me to another question. To what extent does policy design matter? And what explains that some of the poorest countries in the world fully embraced social protection and invested a substantial part of their budgets? Let's assume a government is convinced about the virtue of providing social protection to poor and vulnerable households. What form should it take? Should support be provided in cash? Should it be in kind? Should benefit receipt be tied to any condition? Should the whole population benefit or only specific groups? It may be evident there are no blueprints. Every country is different with different needs and resources. Yet, these key design issues are often debated as if there is a one-size-fits-all policy model. Moreover, the debate is at times polemic, guided by ideology rather than evidence or the consideration of a country's situation. The question whether social protection is more effective if provided in cash as money or in kind, for example food, is probably the least contested. Except for specific circumstances, for example, in the case of acute market shortages, cash is the preferred option. Beneficiaries have the freedom to spend the money according to their preferences, and providing cash is also administratively less expensive. Evidence also shows that the poor spend the cash wisely. Satisfying the basic needs of the family members always has the first priority. Households use the money to increase food consumption, pay for children's education, or spend it on healthcare. Moreover, these programs also benefit the wider community. The money which goes into the household is spent locally, thereby increasing the local demand for goods and services. And evidence from several countries in sub-Saharan Africa shows that every dollar invested in a poor household multiplies total community income between 1.3 and 2.5 times on average. That's a lot. More recently, the trend is towards combining cash with the provision of additional goods and services. These Cash Plus programs, as for example implemented in Ethiopia, Ghana, or Chile, show promising results regarding the sustainable reduction of poverty. The question whether benefits should be tied to specific conditions is more contested. The origin of conditional cash transfers was in Latin America. They became increasingly popular in the late 90s and the early zeros. Conditionality asks for some form of behavioral compliance in the exchange for money or goods. in order to continue receiving support, beneficiaries have to meet certain conditions that are spelled out by the program. Typical conditions are regular school attendance of the children or regular health checks. Engaging in public works or participation requirements, as in the Netherlands, are strictly speaking other examples of conditionality, although they are usually not referred to as such. The underlying idea of a conditionality is to change the behavior of the poor, which is assumed to cause their perpetual poverty and vulnerability. Following a purely economic rationale, conditional cash transfers are inefficient if a household is constrained in the allocation of its budget. The proponents of conditional cash transfers argue that they increase the investments in human capital, particularly of children. They lead to increased school enrollment and better nutritional outcomes. The opponents claim that conditions are inefficient. They impose an additional burden on the poor and punish those that cannot comply with the conditionality for various reasons. The evidence on the effectiveness of conditional cash transfers is mixed. There have only been very few impact evaluations that allowed analyzing the difference between the cash and the condition. Hence, it is almost impossible to say whether the effects, the positive effects that we observe, whether this is due to the cash that went into the household or whether it is due to the condition that was implied on the household. Now, maybe the most fiercely debated issue is the question, who should benefit from social protection? Should anti-poverty programs be targeted to the poor, or should access be universal? It is a long-standing debate where the proponents and opponents of targeting seem to have dug in their heels. From a theoretical perspective, and with a given budget, targeting anti-poverty programs to the poor is the most efficient and effective option to reduce poverty. But people underestimate how difficult it is to target the poor. Efforts to decrease leakage to the non-poor can lead to increasing exclusion errors because the ever stricter application of targeting rules may exclude some of the targeted population. The optimal policy is not necessarily a policy that targets benefits as narrowly as possible. Strongly residual welfare states are unsustainable in the absence of altruistic voters. Yet, as our study in Zambia has shown, the relationship between political considerations and targeting may be less straightforward than thought. Other factors, such as attitudes towards the poor, understanding of the concept of social justice, perceptions about the fairness and effectiveness of social assistance, and personal program experience influence targeting preferences. At the global level, there is a strong movement towards universal social protection. The ILO recommendation 202, adopted in 2012, commits countries to extend minimum income guarantees and access to essential health care to all its citizens. Several countries in Europe, including Switzerland, pilot or discuss the introduction of a universal basic income. But this discussion is not confined to high-income countries. In India, for example, the Ministry of Finance is considering a basic income to replace the current social protection programs. Even if universal provision of social protection is the ultimate goal, the question remains to what extent this is feasible. Societies have different preferences for redistribution, as evidenced by the different welfare state models in Europe and throughout the world. Why have countries, including some of the poorest in the world, decided to invest in social protection? Why are other countries lagging behind, despite the overwhelming international evidence? What are the main factors behind investments in social protection? Our own research tells us that countries with functioning government institutions and with societies in favor of redistribution are more likely to invest in social protection. While the international community plays an important role in creating global awareness about social protection, their influence at the national level is often limited unless there is clear leadership and trust among partners. Social protection policies, particularly non-contributory schemes, they play an important role in guaranteeing a minimum consumption level. They enable productive livelihoods and promote access and utilization of other services. And even though most countries provide some form of social protection, the gaps in the coverage of the poor and vulnerable remain substantial. Moreover, the level of support is insufficient to have a meaningful impact on poverty. In most low and middle-income countries, anti-poverty programs suffer from large exclusion errors and insufficient transfers. Given the limited financial resources, governments are faced with the dilemma whether to extend the horizontal or the vertical dimension of social protection. We need to further our knowledge of the social, economic, and political factors that influence the introduction and extension of social protection systems in low and middle-income countries. In the coming years, I want to focus not only on better understanding which mechanisms and instruments are effective and cost-efficient, given specific environments and contexts, but also to critically assess the potential long-term effects of these public and private social protection investments. Our research will hopefully help to understand how social protection affects intermediate objectives such as the accumulation of human capital, the investment in productive assets, labor market participation, and the conditions under which social protection contributes to inclusive growth. We have plenty of evidence that social protection is effective in increasing the resilience of households against shocks. But we do not know under what conditions social protection systems are sustainable given the global challenges, such as increasing inequality within countries and between countries, or the risks associated with climate change, migration, and humanitarian crisis. Some of the questions I would like to address refer to the conditions under which social protection can play a role in the sustainable graduation from poverty, the reduction of inequality, and the promotion of economic and social mobility. To what extent do preferences for redistribution matter? Current evidence mainly focuses on the positive effects of social protection, yet the unintended consequences are hardly investigated. This also raises the question whether social protection policies are indeed the most effective and efficient instrument to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. Where are the limits to what social protection can achieve? There is a strong demand for rigorous public policy analysis to inform policy decisions at all levels, thereby contributing to the transparency and accountability of policy stakeholders. We will continue to engage with national governments, with bilateral donors and international organizations, and contribute to the public debate at national and international level. As researchers and teachers, we have quite a privileged life, but we also serve the greater good. Hence, we should use our knowledge and skills to contribute to better policies, and as teachers, train the next generations of policymakers. Before I come to the end of this speech, I would like to take some time for some personal comments and words of thanks, and some of them really relate very nicely to what the rector has started with in the beginning. Life is hardly ever a straight line. That I am standing here today is basically the result of love and luck. As most of you know, or you have heard, I was born and raised in Switzerland. And at the age of 20, indeed, I had rather different dreams of what I wanted to become. Professor was not one of them. And to the despair of my father, I even decided against university, but started a career in the fashion industry with, I really thought I will be the next Christian Dior for a short while. But then love brought me to the Netherlands, where I started from scratch. I studied economics here in Maastricht, and I was lucky. Lucky to meet Chris de Neuboer. Towards the end of my study, he invited me to join a big World Bank project in Latvia and Lithuania. And that was the beginning of my career in poverty, public policy analysis, and social protection. The project in Latvia also gave me the opportunity to write my dissertation. I had a part-time contract at SPE, still many of my colleagues here, where I combined teaching with project work and my research. Chris was also the one that convinced me to come back to Maastricht after a few years and help build the School of Governance. Chris, thank you for everything, but most of all, for your continued encouragement and your friendship. There are many other persons that have been decisive for my career, and I also think we deserve a drink, so I will try to limit myself. But I would not be standing here today and give my inaugural lecture without the support of Rian Letchert, our Rector Magnificus, Bernadette Jansma, our former Dean, and Bart Verspagen, the Director of UNU Merit and my boss. You encouraged me and supported my application. Thank you all. I would also like to thank the other members of the review committee, in particular Armando Barrientos from University of Manchester. He is one of the most eminent scholars in social protection. Thank you for giving me the opportunity also to spend a few months in Manchester 2 years ago. My home is the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance and UNU Merit. I can tell you, it is the ideal environment to study social protection and development. I benefit immensely from my colleagues with their different interests and expertise. You broaden my horizon and you enrich my research. I truly enjoy working together with PhD students. Thank you for your patience, I have to say, but also thank you for the many new ideas you bring. During the years that I was self-employed consultant, I realized how important it is for me to work in a team, to have colleagues, to have a work home, so to speak. You, my dear colleagues, make it a place I like going to every day. Thanks for the many moments of happiness and joy, and of course, the morning coffee. None of this would have been possible without the support of families and friends. Thank you for joining me here on this day in Maastricht and celebrate with me. Willem, I cannot tell you how grateful I am to have you at my side. You are my beacon, my solid rock. You are the most generous person I know. As part of my work, I'm traveling the world. I'm gone regularly for 1-2 weeks, You never complain. To the contrary, you always encourage me. If every woman would have such a supporting husband, gender equality would not be an issue. And last but not least, allow me to address my parents in my mother tongue. Ich hoffe, ihr seid immer noch da. Sind sie noch da? Sind sie nicht mehr da? Oh. Kannst du mal probieren? Anyway. Huh? Got it. Okay. So I'm really appreciate to them, and I know that unfortunately they have not been able to be here, and I know I'm 2 years too late to be standing here. But I'm very grateful for them that they have always supported me, and although I also know that some of the decisions I've taken throughout my life were not always, how should I say, in their, as they would have liked them to see. And I remember a couple of moments, usually during a good dinner in a restaurant, that I would drop the bomb, and this is what I'm going to do now. Anyway, I wanted to dedicate this speech and this moment actually to them. Ik heb gezegd. And what now?
Dear Franziska, dear professor, thank you so much for a very inspirational lecture, inaugural lecture. I think your research agenda is quite ambitious, but knowing you, you will manage. And you have Willem. I think everyone wants a Willem. That's maybe a conclusion of, also partly a conclusion of this lecture. So Willem, you should hide maybe at the reception. Thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. We will now move to the reception room, which is our refter, and we kindly ask you to do that by following the cortege. We will leave first. And I wish you all a wonderful weekend, either in Maastricht or back to your home country or wherever you live. And this brings us to the end of this academic session.